Hi biologists, let's start by looking at the learning objectives for this lesson. At the end of this section and following the biology syllabus, you should be able to describe photosynthesis as a two-stage process. What does this actually mean? What are we trying to learn? Take note that this material is for the higher level biology only. At the end of this section, you should be able to describe in detail the two stages of photosynthesis, the light stage and the dark stage. Let's go. Before we begin the detailed study of photosynthesis, which is rather complicated, there are a few basic ideas or concepts that you need to understand. We have these covered in the previous photosynthesis videos, but just to make sure that we have them under our belt, I want to run through them quickly here. There are 5 main ideas worth revising. The first idea is that you can represent the complicated process of photosynthesis by a simple, balanced equation. Carbon dioxide and water are the two ingredients or requirements for photosynthesis, and we're going to make food and give out oxygen gas. O for oxygen and O for out. Now, don't forget that this equation has to be balanced, so we'll give everybody a 6-pack except the guy with the food. So it's 6 carbon dioxides, 6 waters, C6H12O6 stays the same, and 6 oxygen gas. Don't forget this is an energy conversion whereby we are converting the solar energy to chemical energy, and in order to do that we need to have chlorophyll, which is the green colour, remember Phil with the green face. Don't forget crap, which we're not saying too loud. Catabolic reactions, an example of them is respiration, whereas anabolic reactions, the example is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is an anabolic reaction because we're taking simple chemicals, carbon dioxide and water, using energy from the sun and creating a complicated chemical called glucose. The second idea that we must try and remember is the structure of a chloroplast. Remember, this reminds me of a creme egg. So the chloroplast structure has a smooth outer membrane, smooth inner membrane, and then the granums, or to be correct, the grana. Now we are particularly interested in the granum because it is in the granum that we find the chlorophyll, and that is where photosynthesis takes place. You have starch grains, and then you have a loop of DNA, and lastly you have the stroma. The stroma is very important because it is here that the dark stage or the second phase of photosynthesis takes place. This is what the chloroplast looks like under the microscope, if you recall, easily identifiable by the grana, the stacks of membranes, and the stroma, the two areas that we're particularly interested in. Some added detail. Glucose is a carbohydrate. Remember the formula, C6H12O6. It can be represented by a general formula, CxH2OY. Remember, let X equal Y and equal 6. So we put in 6 instead of X, 6 instead of Y, and what will we get? Well, we will get C6H2O6, and multiplying out the brackets in maths, that will give rise to the formula of glucose. So the main point here is we have to recognize the fact that glucose can be represented by the general formula CxH2OY. Now the next very important point is the interconvertibility of ATP. Now remember, when a cell needs energy, where is it going to get the energy from? Well, ATP will release the energy that's contained in the phosphate bonds. When ATP releases that energy, it will be converted into ADP. ADP because it has 2 phosphates and a phosphate that's set free, if you like. Now, when energy is released in the cell and it needs to be stored, then the ADP, which is like an empty van, and phosphorus will join to make ATP, and we're basically back where we started again, ATP, an energy-rich molecule. We have the same idea when it comes to NADP+. Do you remember NADP in photosynthesis? NADP's taxi service? Well, what can NADP+ pick up? Well, it can pick up 2 electrons and a H+, and when it does, it is converted into NADPH. And again, the whole idea of interconvertibility is important here because the NADPH can drop off the 2 electrons, drop off the H+, and be converted back to NADP+. So NADP+ is a low energy molecule and NADPH is an energy rich molecule. Now, the last concept that's important to realize here is the structure of the cross-section of a leaf. So going through the parts of the cross-section of a leaf, we have a cuticle, which is a waxy layer, a non-cellular layer. We have dermal tissue, also called the upper epidermis. We have palisade cells. The palisade cells, P for palisade, P for packing, P for photosynthesis. It's up in the palisade cells that most photosynthesis will be carried out. This is why they have such densely packed cells and why they have such a lot of chloroplasts in them, explaining why the top surface of a leaf is darker green than the lower surface. If we were to visualize that the photosynthesis is taking place here in these palisade cells, photosynthesis can also take place in these round ground tissue cells called Spongy Mesophyll. Both these cells are green, the palisade cells, the Spongy Mesophyll cells, and together can be taken as ground tissue. Lastly, we have the lower epidermis or dermal tissue. Now, why this is so relevant here is we're going to visualize that photosynthesis is taking place in these palisade cells. So we have to have the image that the carbon dioxide needed for photosynthesis is going to come in through the stomatas of the leaf and find its way up into the palisade cells and into the Spongy Mesophyll cells that can also do photosynthesis, and eventually finding its way up into the chloroplasts that are the little structures inside in the cells that carry out photosynthesis. Now that we have all those concepts under our belt, it is time to start the detailed study of photosynthesis. Now, the first thing we have to realize is that photosynthesis is a process that takes place in 2 stages or 2 phases. The first phase is the light-dependent stage, quite often called the light stage, and the other phase is the light-independent stage, or often called the dark stage. Now, both of these processes take place in the chloroplast. The light phase takes place in the granum. Now, in order to understand photosynthesis, we have to visualize that that is where we are at the moment. We are in the grana of the chloroplasts. Now, in the grana of the chloroplast, there are a number of different chemicals. There are chlorophyll molecules, there are electron acceptor chemicals, and ADP, which is our empty van, our low energy molecule. We have NADP+, which is our empty taxi looking for customers. And I visualize that all of these chemicals are like little houses with taxis and vans driving between them. So hence we have chlorophyll here located in the granum, and we have electron acceptors located in the granum, and we have a bunch of houses which are like a housing estate. We have a bunch of chemicals together forming an electron transport chain. Note, etc. A whole pile of houses, a whole pile of chemicals, one after the other, like a housing estate, the electron transport chain, ETC. These are all found in the grana of the chloroplast, as we have just said. We also have water present in the grana of the chloroplast. So what happens? Well, it does make it a lot easier if we imagine this to be a story. The sun shines down on the chlorophyll, a complicated chemical. When the sun shines on the chlorophyll, electrons, which are charged particles, will get energy. These energized electrons will leave the chlorophyll and be accepted by a neighbouring chemical called an electron acceptor. I visualise these high energy electrons as being like children going trick-or-treating and all excited and going into the house next door. Having spent a little bit of time in the electron acceptor, the high energy electrons will leave the electron acceptor and pass through the electron transport chain, rather like the children setting out to trick-or-treat around the housing estate. As the children go from house to house, they lose their energy. The same thing with the energized electrons. As they are passed from electron acceptor to electron acceptor in the electron transport chain, the high energy electrons lose their energy. Now, who is in the neighbourhood? The empty van, the low energy molecule ADP. So the ADP will pick up the energy released by the energized electrons and be converted into the high energy molecule ATP. And like the children exhausted from trick-or-treating, the electrons will return home to the chlorophyll, having lost their energy. So in a nutshell, what is the point of this pathway 1? What is the point of this cyclic return back to chlorophyll? Well, the point of it is that you generate the high energy molecule, a store of energy for the cell. You generate ATP. Let's have a look at this happening. Here the electrons come back home to the chlorophyll again. Now this, don't forget, is called the light-dependent stage. It takes place in the grana, hence the green background, and this is one of 2 pathways available to the energized electrons. There is a second alternative. The energized electrons passed the electron acceptors before, but this time, who's in the neighbourhood? NADP's taxi service, NADP+. The NADP+ will accept the electrons in pairs and become NADP-. Now don't forget, water is also present in the grana. Here it is looking for attention. The sun shines down on the water, and when it does, it breaks the water up. The water will be broken down into oxygen gas, which is released to the atmosphere or can be used by the neighbouring cells in respiration. H+ will also be released from the water molecule. The H+ will hang around in a gang in what we call the proton pool. Now don't forget, H+ is the third customer that NADP+ is looking for. So it'll pick up the H+ from the proton pool and become NADPH. In other words, it's hired. The NADPH will then drive or move into the stroma to take part in the dark stage. More about that later. High energy electrons will leave the water. These high energy electrons, like the trick-or-treating children, go through another electron transport chain. As they go from electron acceptor to electron acceptor, they will lose their energy. The energy is picked up by ADP, which now becomes ATP, an energy-rich molecule. The electrons are then funneled off to replace the electrons that it had lost. Now take note here that the electrons that chlorophyll loses, here in purple, are not the same electrons that return to chlorophyll here in blue. So basically in pathway 1, represented in red, the same electrons return to the chlorophyll. But in pathway 2 here, represented by the purple, the electrons leave the chlorophyll and are picked up by NADP+, and the chlorophyll will be replenished by electrons, represented in blue, that are released by the water. Those of you who are sharp-eyed might notice that the oxygen gas is actually coming from the O in the water molecule. This water had been absorbed by the roots, so isn't it fascinating to think that the oxygen given out in photosynthesis actually came from the water molecules that were originally present in the soil. Also, you might notice that the H pluses from the water are shipped off with NADPH to take part in the dark stage. We can include a few more details, especially for those of you able for a bit more. White light is made up of different colours or wavelengths. We can see this in the 7 colours of the rainbow. Richard of York gave battle in vain. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo and violet. Now, chloroplasts have a range of pigments along with the chlorophyll to absorb the different wavelengths of light. This means that plants can absorb as much light energy as possible. In general, plants absorb all wavelengths except green, which is actually reflected, and that explains why most plants are green. So, some pigments called antennae pigments, here they are here, are arranged strategically or on purpose to funnel as much light as possible onto the reaction centre of chlorophyll. So it would be no harm to include these little extra labels as an extra bit of detail for those of you who like detail. So we have the antennae pigments and we'll include the label reaction centre. Let's put in the label PW for pathway 1 and add the label PW for pathway 2. It's also no harm to include the label photolysis, the photolysis of water, which is the breaking down of water using light. Lysis is the Latin word or whatever for breaking down. And lastly, let's include a note on the products of the light stage. The products of the light stage are oxygen gas, ATP and NADPH, as we can see here at the top. And a little note on their fate. Not their faith, they don't pray, their fate, meaning what happens to them. Well, the oxygen gas is destined to be released to the atmosphere or used by neighbouring cells in respiration, and ATP and NADPH are destined to be made use of in the light-independent stage of photosynthesis, which is the next stage that we have to study. Now, this outline diagram has all the key points for the treatment of photosynthesis, and it should be enough on its own to obtain full marks. We should now have a good understanding of the process, but it is up to you to learn this diagram properly and practice it in your jotter. However, sometimes the exam question might say, because they're ahead of us, that a diagram is not enough. So to be sure, my advice would be to know this diagram along with the following account. Photosynthesis is a two-stage process. The first stage, driven by light energy, is called the light stage or the light-dependent stage. The second stage, which is dependent on the products of the light stage and does not require light. This is called the dark stage or the light-independent stage. Now we need to be very careful here. This means it does not require light to function. That's why it's called the dark stage. But it does not happen at night. It doesn't happen in the dark. It happens during the day. This can be very confusing. It is called the dark stage because it doesn't require light, but it does not happen at night. Photosynthesis never goes on at night. Now the light-dependent stage account. The light energy is absorbed and it passes from pigment to pigment in the chloroplast until it reaches a reaction centre chlorophyll molecule. From here, energized electrons can enter two paths. A. They can return directly to chlorophyll, releasing their surplus energy for the formation of ATP. B. 2 electrons are trapped by NADP+, forming NADP-. This leaves the chlorophyll molecules electron deficient or missing their electrons. So water, H2O, splits into 2 protons, electrons and oxygen gas. The electrons recycle back to the chlorophyll. The hydrogen ions, or the protons, enter a proton pool, and oxygen gas is released to the atmosphere or used in respiration. The hydrogen ions from the proton pool are attracted to the NADP- to form NADPH. What are the end products of the light stage? Well, ATP is formed, which will provide the energy for the dark stage. A van load of energy, an energy-rich molecule. NADPH will supply electrons and protons or hydrogen ions for the dark stage. NADPH hired. 2 electrons in the back seat, H+ in the front seat. Oxygen gas is also formed. This passes out of the leaf to the atmosphere or is used in respiration by neighbouring cells. So ADP will leave the granum and enter the stroma to take part in the dark stage of photosynthesis. NADPH will leave the granum and enter the stroma to take part in the dark stage of photosynthesis. This now brings us to the light independent stage, or the dark stage of photosynthesis. Now don't forget, it's vitally important to understand that this can be the dark stage, but it doesn't take place at night. It is independent of light. It doesn't require light to function. As you will notice in a second, the picture of the sun features nowhere. So carbon dioxide enters the leaf, as we saw earlier, and is now sitting in the stroma waiting to be turned into or to become carbohydrate. That is the aim of its life. All it wants in life is to be a star. It just wants to be a carbohydrate. So it will turn into C6H12O6 or sugar. Now what does it need to do that? What does it need to achieve its dream? Well, first of all, it needs electrons and protons, and this can be supplied by the NADPH from the light stage. So the electrons and the protons are supplied, and when they are, the NADPH becomes the empty taxi NADP+, which can then return to the light stage looking for more electrons and protons. But this is not enough. This reaction also requires some energy. The energy is provided by the ATP, which we made in the light stage. The energy is supplied by the ATP, and this is then converted into ADP, which is a low energy molecule, and this can then return to the granum, to the light stage, to pick up more energy. Now again, this outline diagram has all the key points for a treatment of the dark stage. It should be enough on its own to obtain full marks. You should now have a good understanding of the process. It is up to you to learn this outline diagram properly and practice it in your jotter. However, sometimes exam questions might say that a diagram is not enough. So to be sure, let's make sure that we know this diagram along with the following account. The light independent stage, the dark stage. NADPH supplies electrons, which are a reducing power. They actually reduce the carbon dioxide to becoming carbohydrate, and hydrogen ions. The electrons and hydrogen ions are used to convert carbon dioxide to carbohydrate. ATP supplies the energy for the process. ADP and NADP+ return to the light stage to be reused. The end products of the dark stage. Well, glucose is made, which is used for energy, or it is stored as starch in the plant. Don't forget from the food chapter, starch is the storage polysaccharide found in plants. ADP is reused in the light stage to form ATP. Remember, ADP is an empty van. It is a low energy molecule. NADP plus is reused in the light stage to form NADPH. Don't forget, NADP plus, the empty taxi looking for passengers. So these molecules leave the stroma and drive and return to the granum to pick up more energy and to pick up more electrons and more protons for the dark stage. Some added detail to just polish this a little bit more. The light stage takes place in the grana. The dark stage takes place in the stroma of the chloroplast. The light stage needs light and takes place only in the light, meaning it needs light to function. The dark stage uses ATP and NADPH made in the light stage. So it needs the light stage to have taken place, but it does not actually need the light itself. No enzymes are used in the light stage. The dark stage reactions do involve enzymes. Don't forget it is an anabolic reaction. Anabolic reactions require enzymes. Therefore, because the reactions involve enzymes, the dark stage reactions are susceptible to temperature, or they're controlled by temperature. Some added extra. Now, strictly speaking, this is not a requirement of the syllabus, but as a challenge, you could put on your thinking cap and be expected to rise to the occasion. Basically, from what you have learned and from your understanding, you should be well able to compare the light-dependent and the light-independent stages. To make life easier, we can see this in the table here. First of all, the light-dependent stage is located in the grana, whereas the dark stage is located in the stroma. The light-dependent stage depends on light, the light-independent stage does not. The light stage produces ATP, the dark stage uses it. The light stage, chlorophyll is involved, whereas chlorophyll is not involved in the dark stage. In the light stage, NADP plus, the empty taxi, accepts the passengers, 2 electrons and a proton. The NADPH releases 2 electrons and a proton in the dark stage. In the light stage, oxygen gas is released. Remember, oxygen out. Whereas in the dark stage, carbon dioxide is actually used. Now that we've reached the end of our lesson, have we achieved our objective? Are you able to describe photosynthesis as a 2-stage process?